Welcome everyone to the first edition of the Verisian Community Podcast. It's my pleasure to introduce two good friends of mine, Henning and Sunil. But first, before we dive into the topic that we want to talk about today, just a little bit of background about who we are and why we're doing this podcast. Henning and I started Verisian only, I think, 5 months ago. And we've been very passionate to share a lot of the knowledge that we've encountered for people in the industry. And one of our big missions with creating the Verisian community is to bring people together virtually and in person. And one of the ways we want to do that is by hosting a regular series of podcasts to invite the people that we know, share knowledge, build a community, and see what happens. Because I think there's really nothing more beautiful than bringing people together and seeing how we can build a better future together, whether that's with technology, healthcare, or in any other field. Stay tuned with us. We're open for feedback. So all of our listeners, if you're interested to listen about specific topics or anything, or anyone, even if you want to join as a guest of one of our future podcasts, please let us know. We've got an online community as well. So check out our page online. We'll be updating it regularly alongside other blog posts, webinars, and in-person events that are coming up as well. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce from all over the world, actually. I'm currently in London. It's freezing here. Henning, who's actually in Berlin. So how's the weather in Berlin, Henning?
Also freezing here with snow and everything.
And Sunil, you're on the other side of the world, which you're in Los Angeles, which I'm assuming is a little bit better.
Yeah, Los Angeles weather is really great. And evenings are getting a little cool, but during the day it's very pleasant. So definitely walking weather, nice and sunny weather for sure.
Excellent. Firstly, thank you so much both for joining us today. Sunil, I'd love for you to introduce yourself a little bit to the audience. Can you tell us a little bit about your story, your journey?
Sure. Yeah. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for well over three decades now, and really passionate about working with clinical trials, the outcome of working on studies as far as medical devices or pharmaceutical companies, working with the clinical data, and attending conferences of like-minded people. That's really exciting. Recently, I was the co-chair of the Few Single Day event, and that's where we had an opportunity to meet you, Thomas, as an invited speaker. We had some really good topics and discussions. I'm really, passionate about leveraging technology. In earlier days, I've been very active about leveraging metadata because I'm a big advocate of standardization and automation. There's a tremendous benefit to be, from that. And I think with that, I've been fortunate enough to meet you and then be invited to this podcast.
And I think that was a wonderful day. And actually, I think we met the night before because there was the dinner, and we had some margaritas at someone's place before we headed out to there were a lot of margaritas flowing that evening.
That's
so awesome. And gosh, that's already 3 months ago. Time flies.
That's true. Yep. A lot has happened since those past 3 months.
And Henning, of course, we've known each other for many years in different capacities, but tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you ended up co-founder, CTO of Verisian.
Sure. Yeah. Basically, from my background, I'm a biomedical scientist mostly, but I also studied software engineering. And during my PhD, I worked on a variety of topics. I did some work in epigenetics, sensory perception, and metabolism. But independent of the field, I was always building software in order to do science and either do or analyze experiments in ways that weren't possible before without that software. Yeah, after my academic career, I worked at Bayer for about 7 years. There I worked in the IT and infrastructure, did some product management, but also engineering, and finally ended up in basic computational research, which is basically where you and I met again when you were at Vatical, and I was using Type2B, formerly known as Kraken. So I did some work actually with Kraken, built the now called Type2B loader. So that's how we've known each other also, I think, since 2019 already. And so basically at the beginning of this year, we started Verisian, really in the more towards the middle of the year, at least officially. And here we are.
Yeah, and it's been quite the journey. I remember it was a shame we didn't get to meet because we organized. So for also the audience, for context, the last company I was building was an open source database company where Henning was a very valued customer of ours at Bayer. And we organized one of our main user conference. We organized it. You won't believe it. I still think about it, how lucky we were. But we organized it. I don't know if I told you, Sunil, but we organized a very big conference with 300 speakers, 300 guests, 25, 30 speakers, literally at the beginning of February 2020.
Oh,
And
wow.
6 weeks, 4 or 6 weeks later, down happened. And
Oh my gosh.
and
That's
Henning would have
terrible.
and Henning would have come, but his firstborn or secondborn, I think,
Oh, I
came.
see.
So obviously, I'm
Oh,
glad he
wow.
didn't attend. But so yeah, those are definitely different times. So switching a little bit and talking about the topic that we want to discuss today, which is, so we've recently released a demo, and that demo is called the Validation Engine. And in that demo, we've tried to put together something very quickly. We built it in just a couple of weeks to showcase to the world a little bit what our philosophy is on how we think we can help the world of statistical programming. And maybe perhaps, Henning, could you start by telling the audience a little bit about what we've done with the validation engine and why you think it's useful for programmers?
Yeah, sure. So the validation engine, like you said, is basically, let's say, an expression of the core technology that we're building. So it's powered by our graph analytics. And what we do is we analyze SAS logs of a clinical trial or a study analysis. And this can be logs for an entire study or even just a single log file for a single analysis. And so from this, let's go with the case of a full study. We can produce a graph that contains a representation essentially for anything that happens in that analysis. So every line of code, every data set, every variable, any derivation, all of it is in there. And so we can provide a full traceability. You can pick any point in the code or any data set that you're interested in, any variable, and you can figure out what all is required to produce it, and everything that it depends on. And so that is what we call the full traceability. And so fundamentally, the demo shows exactly that. So one of the views of the demo is that you can actually look into that study graph and you can traverse the whole dependency graph of all the data sets. So that's the level that we chose to display for the demo. And the other thing is then, because we wanted to really showcase the value of it from a specific angle, which is the logs. So when we find log messages, we can also attach them to the graph, because a log message, of course, comes from some executed code, which maybe didn't work the way it was supposed to. And so the log messages are now attached to that graph. And so what we can show is, for any log messages, exactly where did it occur. That everyone can do. You can just look into the logs. But we can also do a couple of other things. So we can, from there, very easily figure out what the log message is likely about. And even more exciting, we can show how log messages are connected. So maybe how one log message that is upstream in analysis is an indication for why there are downstream problems, which again is indicated by other log messages. And so that is really what the demo is trying to show. It's a mixture of capability, but also immediate use, because you get an overview of an entire trial or a trial analysis. So it's easy to understand how it was built. It's easier to onboard people that are maybe new to that trial. And it gives you a full overview of the log messages and how they're connected, as well as suggestions for how to fix them.
And Sunil, you've worked in the industry for a long time. You have so much experience. I listened to your talk at the Fuse SD in Silicon Valley, and I was amazed by your expertise. I'm curious, how do you see this being placed in the workflow of a statistical program? And what are your thoughts generally about the demo and what Henning just said?
Yeah, actually, I'm very excited about this. As you know, traditionally, programmers, what they do is, if you're working in the SAS environment, you have a display manager. And in that display manager, you have individual programs that you're working with. And for programmers, definitely taking a look at the log is part of the process when you're running the programs and you're debugging. And so programmers are very familiar with the log, but it's a very manual type process. It's an individual program type of a process that you go through, and you make sure that programs are working fine. But what I really like about this approach and the technology that's being introduced here is leveraging the metadata behind the programs. So programmers aren't just working with one program; they're working with a collection of programs that may be called macros or other programs. So there's a level of complexity, there's a level of hierarchy, there's a level of organization, priority, dependency that's there. And instead of manually tracing and going through the programs, of course, as programmers, we have to structure and set this up and everything. But if we can have technology or tools that enable us to be organized, especially in a visualization way that connects programs, and not only that, have a way that the log actually is executable code. When we run macros, we may not actually have the actual code with us, but in the log, it's get executed. And be able to trace the executable code with the actual code representation, it seems is a very great potential for, I think, SAS programmers. I'm really excited to learn more about it.
So now, Henning, obviously what we're trying to do in our mission goes beyond just the validation engine. From what Sunil said, tell our listeners a little bit about how the validation then connects to the larger mission of Verisian.
Yeah, so maybe we start with the larger mission itself. So what we really want to do is make clinical trial analysis faster, cheaper, and better. And that's that magic triangle that people say you actually can't do, because if you make something faster and cheaper, then you can't raise the quality and so on. So there's always a trade-off between these three dimensions. But the truth, of course, is that you can change it, but then you have to change the whole paradigm of how something is done. So you have to fundamentally do it differently. And that's really what we're trying to do. So we're trying to introduce a paradigm shift with this new software and tooling that's based on our graph analytics and also the graph-based AI that we're developing. I would say the core piece of it is, at least for the next year or so, is the Statistical Programming Hub, of which the validation engine is one component. We're calling these engines. So the validation engine basically focuses on ensuring quality and analysis integrity, and then as well as adherence to SOPs, regulatory authority requirements, all of these sorts of things. So it's a bit of the quality control arm of the whole thing, which is you have that in software development as well. You have your testing, you have your QA, and so on. The other part is really the building. And so if we want to do things faster, that also means we have to build faster. And that's really the other part of it. It's really two sides of a single coin, which is the validation engine one side and the analysis engine on the other one. And so one of the things that Sunil just said about the macro system. So the macro systems are great for generating code and doing that in a standardized way, but it's moving towards generation. And you just call this little line, but you actually not always know what's behind it. And also for people then to understand what is behind that, it's literally a small little black box that you can't look into. And so what we can do now is we can resolve all of that through analyzing the logs, so we can tell what code was actually executed. And what would be great then is the next logical step really also is that you would be able to take that code that is extracted and then work with it directly, right? Independent of whether it came out of a macro or not. And so that's where the analysis engine really starts. So we can use the analysis engine and this combination with the validation engine to extract old code and reuse it. But we can also then, in this analysis engine, build code much more quickly because it's integrated with the validation engine. So as you build new code, as you read in a data set and you create a new one, it will in real time update that graph that shows you the overall overview of your analysis. And so you can actually see how you're changing the structure. And we have this feature in mind called Edit in Confidence, which will tell you that if you modify some code, so let's say there's already an analysis, but something is not quite right and you're working on a little piece of it, and you're changing how a variable is derived in a data set, it will tell you exactly what consequence that change has in all of the downstream data sets that depend on that line of code basically that you just changed. And so what that will do is, instead of you having to make a fix basically and running in that problem that all programmers have, is that you might be introducing more bugs than you're fixing with that one line change, is you actually will get, you could think of it a little bit like a to-do list that says, okay, these are all the things that you have affected. This is exactly how you affected them. Is this what you meant to do? And if you go through it and you say yes, then your fix is an actual fix. But that just ensures that when you do make edits, that you're actually having the intended consequence. And I think especially this part was something that a lot of the users that we've been talking to, the clinical analysts that we've been talking to say is that the pressure to be correct and have your analysis actually be integral and not introduce any new errors is so high that a feature like this that would just give you the confidence and everyone else the confidence that as you develop new things or as you try to fix things, these actually fix things and don't introduce more problems, that would be a great value. And again, just save an extraordinary amount of time, because instead of having to go through hundreds of lines potentially of code where your changes might have had effects, exactly where to look, and you only have to look there. So it's going to cut down the time that it takes you to do that absolutely dramatically.
Sunil, what do you think about that? And specifically, tell me your thoughts and our listeners about changing the way programmers go about building their programs, whether it's Atom, TFLs, anything else. How can are programmers open to those changes? And how would you even go about doing those things, given that these are large organizations with very established environments? And we've had a lot of conversations with programmers that are very open to that, but they themselves aren't quite sure how to go about doing that because they're not the ones responsible. What do you think?
Yeah, no, definitely. Those are all good questions and very valid questions as well. Many organizations are well established. They do have systems in place, programs, macros in place, and everything. Many organizations also, I guess, several things. They have a scan log, so they realize the importance of checking the results of SAS programs. Ideally, the scan logs would be summarized and it has a list, but there's a lot of limitations in what organizations have as far as a scan log. The ability to make program corrections with this type of tool is phenomenal. I think that people will need to see it in action to see that, okay, a change using this tool could actually update the programs. But more importantly, with the tool that helps us identify through a visual concept with a dashboard, and everybody's pretty much sold on dashboards. The key thing about dashboards is you put the key things in the KPIs, the things that are most important. So when we're talking about SAS logs, we're talking about errors, warnings, and notes. So we want to know across the board, not just in one program, but a collection of programs that are used, whether it's to create STTMs, atoms, or TLGs, where are the vulnerable points? Where are those issues? Obviously, we want to have clean logs. So getting rid of identifying, removing all the errors. But there could be cases where warnings or notes come up. And in particular, when organizations, what they do is they have a software development lifecycle. So they do the development of the individual programs. And when they pass QC, they put in a production environment. In a production environment, they will have scripts. So they will run these on a regular basis. What I see organizations, doing is leveraging this type of tool technology in their production environment, mainly because it's an automated way to scan programs, scan logs to give them a first-hand view. We always want to be proactive. And a technology tool like this enables us to be very proactive without having to do manual effort. So we can have dashboards that give us information in advance. Previously, what organizations would do is they would maybe put information within their programs to capture error messages and then loop and feed that back maybe as an email because they want to really be proactive. Because the last thing that you want is things to fall and errors and down days or weeks later and someone else finding issues that you may have in your program. I think while this is a kind of a revolutionary approach, where you have a system to monitor and then actually make updates to the program. So I think something that programmers it will definitely, I think, welcome, but it'll be a little bit of, okay, can this really work for me? And so they'll be a little bit cautious, but I think it'll be exciting to see how this, plays out.
And I think, those are really interesting conversations. I think I was in China 3 weeks ago, and what's really interesting is that all of these challenges and these conversations are ubiquitous across the board. Everyone talks about the decoupling between the West and China, but I found it fascinating that the passion that people have, whether it's programmers in the US, in Europe, in India, in China, in Japan, is all similar, and that's really interesting. A question for you, Henning, and it's a bit of a loaded question. Actually, I want to hear your opinion on this as well, Sunil. Now, but Henning, you've got a lot of experience in software engineering across different fields, and in your opinion, how do you define code quality? And specifically, how do you see that view of code quality perhaps differ from normal software engineering to clinical programming?
Yes. So I would try to split that up maybe first with the commonalities and then maybe what the differences would be. So I think common is that I would say robustness is probably one of the main things. So that the code that you write is able to handle situations that you maybe didn't think of. So it's this classical try-catch structure where you're trying something and you formalize your assumptions that you think you can do it in code. And so it's sort of the robustness of being able to handle unexpected events, unexpected data. I think that's very similar in both cases. The other thing that I think, especially as you get more senior in development, that becomes more and more important is how transparent it is, how transparent your code is. So how easy is it for yourself to understand after 2 months? How easy is it for someone else to understand? Because that has immediate implications for maintainability and just as soon as you work on projects beyond just yourself. And again, like I said, even if it's just you, usually after 2 months, when you look back at anything that's non-trivial, you're what exactly happened here? What did I do here? What was I thinking? Right. So I think even if you become like more verbose, and I do a lot of things which I know I could do differently, but I do them because I know that if I go back to it 2 months later, I understand what I was doing. And that sort of flows also into the extendability, so that you write code in such a way that if you then have to modify it, or you say, this is an interesting avenue, or this is an important feature, I build it in such a way that I can build on top of that afterwards. Which is similar to reusability, that you write it in such a way that you can reuse functionality again all over the place. And that's a massive topic for anything that's analytics focused and not so much software development focused, because having to rewrite analyses that you've done before is, of course, a waste of time in all worlds. The other thing that I think that's more common in software engineering is testing, because testing in data analytics is a bit more difficult, because you're basically testing data and how data flows through something, and that tends to be a bit more difficult than testing functionality of code itself. Yeah. But I think fundamentally the principles are very much the same. The main difference is that maybe in analysis you have a more or less defined inputs, and you have an end to the analysis, right? So it starts somewhere and it ends somewhere. Wherein if you work in application codes, there's not really a defined end. It's more that there's a set of processes that sort of have a start and end, of course, but they're all interconnected. And yeah, so I know it's a bit of a wishy-washy answer, but I think the core and the commonality of this robustness, writing clean code, or having several steps instead of one giant big one that solves everything, but that neither you nor anyone else can understand, and it's impossible to debug if there's any changes to be made. I think those are really the main ones. And of course, if you're in the analytical space, then what's most important, I would say, is that you can handle or be aware of seeing unexpected data and inputs, because the greatest danger is that there are no errors thrown because the code works, but it's doing something which you didn't intend it to do. And I think the danger for that is actually higher in data analysis than in more of the classical software engineering. And so I think that's one of those things that we want to look into very strongly with the validation engine, that it's not just catching log messages, which is fundamentally, like Sunil says, right? Everyone probably has a tool for that, where it says here, I don't know, you're trying to do an operation on missing values, but the question is, where do these missing values come from? And can't we, as someone develops code or as someone modifies code, can't we in real time look at it and say, look, if you do this, given the fact that you're in this spot, in this data analysis, if there is, let's say, a missing value 3 steps up, and because that's just the data that comes in, then you're going to have a problem, which you can't see right now because it hasn't happened yet, so it's not in the log, but your code is written in such a way that you're going to produce this. So I think this predictive power, which is basically the fusion of taking, looking at the code and really understanding what someone's writing, and then being able to say, this code actually is robust, or no, we can basically identify already cases in which your code will fail, highlighting that, and then even connecting it to maybe log messages which are in a different spot, but they're really indicating the problem is somewhere else. I think that's really where this traceability comes in extremely handy. So we are going to be pushing a lot of these software engineering principles into our analysis. And it's not to overwhelm people, right? It's not going to be like big word and complicated explanations for how we did this. It's really just what we're trying to do is abstract that away, right? So there should be a message that says, look, this code can produce the following issues. If you write it in this way, all of that disappears. And then ideal, just a button where you say, okay, accept. I agree. That's the idea.
And how do you see it, the topic of code quality in clinical programming?
Yeah, no, just to add on to that, I totally agree. I think the concept of program validation and compliance. So when we're talking about in this regulatory environment, we're talking about strict compliance. A tool like this, what happens is you have a team. So you have individual programmers, you have a source programmer, QC programmer, you have several people. And so a lead would have ultimate responsibility. The lead would be taking a look at this type of tool to take a look at overall what's going on across the program. And I really like the concept of traceability. What was mentioned before is the scan log. That's something that is pretty standard, common in the industry. But a tool such as this is going to enable us to do a lot more. And that's exciting. The concept of traceability, where you can trace the impact. Many organizations will do type of impact analysis. And so having a tool to facilitate impact analysis, enables us to make better decisions in a very timely manner. The thing that you can eliminate manual process. And this is a very integrated. The tool like this has to be fully integrated with the program. That makes it very much interactive. And so that's really exciting to see, again, the visual component of that and being able to drill down. I think that really empowers SaaS programmers to provide more or better service or higher compliance in this regulatory environment. So I think these are really nice features, that programmers will welcome.
And maybe if I can add to that, to just pick up what Sunil said about this drill down idea that he was referring to, that you have a visual representation, but you have this integration directly with the code. I think one way of thinking about this is actually that the ultimate source of truth of everything that we're doing is either the log or the code that we extract out of it. And for probably the vast majority of the functionality, it's going to be the code itself. And so really what we're doing with this overview of showing how the data sets are created and how they depend on each other and so on, it comes out of the code. So you can think of it as like one view of the actual code. But we can show a similar view on variable level, and we can show a similar view on, if you're interested in formats, right? So where are they created? How are they stored? Where and when are they applied to which data set and so on? Because if you use formats, formatting features, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong because of the way you're using formats. So it's just, what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out what are the best ways of displaying this ultimately extremely high complexity of all the things that are happening in a complicated analysis, and give them to you piecemeal, that it's easy for you, that you can go through them like one by one, and it becomes very transparent. And it's not just you, the programmer, but also if you're in a discussion with someone, let's say maybe with a statistician, that you can actually say, this is exactly what I implement. Is this in accordance with the SAP? Is this in accordance with what you were thinking? And you have a different level of basis for communication. It's not just the code, but ultimately anything that we show you at any level, you can always go back to the source of truth in the code, and we can tell you exactly, this is exactly where it was specified, this is exactly where it was applied, and this is how we can tell that these are the same two things. So that's what gives you the confidence, at the same time being able then to go into these higher levels of abstractions to facilitate the communication. And that can go within your team, within the programming team, between validation and the people who are writing like the first ideas, exploration, and as we imagined, Tomás very well, maybe also towards regulatory authorities eventually, that it's easier for them to understand what is happening in analysis and how it was structured, etc. But that's a bit more down the line.
So the last thing I wanted to talk about today, and it's something that it's on everyone's mind. So it's something we have to touch, despite I know some of the opinions that you guys have on this, but generative AI, the biggest buzzword going on today. So now I'd like to start with you. How do you see generative AI, and is there any role for Gen AI in statistical programming where 99% is just not good enough? It has to be 100% correct. And obviously, statistical methods are by definition probabilistic in nature, and having a deterministic AI system is against the whole principle of an LLM. But I'd love to hear your view on this.
Yeah, obviously, when you're talking about AI, it conjures up maybe some fear and some uncertainty and unknown, because you're not exactly sure what exactly it is. But then on the other side, we have seen technology. We've seen advancements in cars, for example. So we can see, I guess, the benefits of it. One of the things that, when I look at a new technology or maybe losing AI, I see, okay, how can I relate to that? How does it make sense to me? Okay, so the backbone of it as a programmer, I try to take a look at the design of it. What's the back end of it? So maybe it's working off of metadata components, and then can that simulate an organization based on what I know? And I can come up with some ways that it could happen, and the technology can make it happen. One of the key things that I think people should take a look at when we're taking a look at tools, and then specifically when you're talking about AI tools, because we want to have some type of benefit from them, because there's some intelligence or some smart, and we have the smartphones. It empowers us to do more, but we have to be careful.
Yes.
We have to be careful to make sure that what is actually doing is actually what I consider to be invalidated and actually useful for the user. Those two things, how useful is it for as an actual way to translate into actual true benefits, and is it really validated? And so those two things, I think, if I feel real comfortable about that, I think it can really go a long ways to really save me the time and still have the high quality results that my team would expect from me.
And how do you see the role of AI in general in clinical programming, Henning?
I think it's very difficult, obviously, because it's moving very quickly. There's developments everywhere. But so as I've been struggling with this myself and trying to put it into some sort of frame, and where can it be useful? Where should it be useful? I think that's really a question that isn't asked enough. Where should it be useful? Where should it be applied? And how should it be applied? And so the way I've been thinking about it is just from first principles is that, and I think Sunil basically said the same thing, which is that what is the source? Like, where does it come from, and in which direction? That's the way I'm thinking about it. Does it generate? And so I think if it generates from natural language into analysis, so it's trying to go from something where someone says, this is my clinical trial. These are the kind of patients that I have in there. This is the kind of endpoint I want. Now generate me an analysis. I find that to be very unlikely to be successful very soon, because you're going from, let's say, lower information density, and you're trying to get something extremely specific out of it. That might be very complicated. But if you go on about it the other way, like where can we go to an actual source of truth, and then from there generate something which is maybe a bit less dense? And this is probably apparent by now, but we're focusing on code. And the reason why, Tomás, I gave you a lot of my opinion on that at the very beginning, is that the ultimate source of truth of what a clinical trial is, or what happens in it, is actually the analysis, right? So a clinical trial really is the analysis plus the data. And the analysis sets everything into context with the metadata and with the data, and then ultimately the conclusions. And so what I think is that if you start with code and you train and fine tune on code, and then you try to support the processes, which now just take a lot of effort, but a lot of them are repetitive, but you go from this higher information density to something that's a bit less, then I think they can be very efficient, always with the idea that they make the processes more efficient and don't take over the process of creating the science itself. Because I think for science to work, and I think a lot of the discovery and creativity comes out of friction with the problem itself. So if people are too far removed from the friction, I think a lot of things are going to be lost. I'll try to get very concrete now after this philosophy. So if we start with code, what are the things that we can do in clinical trials that I think would be very useful? So one thing is, there's going to be boilerplate code that everyone has to write. That's just a pain. And we do this in software engineering, and actually the big models are now actually quite good at just writing the really, really boring stuff. But as soon as you get to more complicated things, they go off very, very quickly. But so I think the boilerplate code stuff, I think we can say that would be useful, right? So if you have an AI agent that is sort of trained in SAT, it's specifically trained for clinical trials and how things are done, they can probably write some stuff that's very useful automatically and save you time. The other thing is, there's a big transition now, or at least an attempt for a transition from SAS to R. And so going from one language to another language, I think that's also realistic. So if there are certain things or modules or like macrosystems or things that macrosystems produce that would be useful to translate from SAS to R, I think that's also realistic. The other thing is, I think it could greatly help in communication. So if you want to, for example, help the medical writers to write first drafts of certain submission documents, because a lot of that information is either in data or in code or in the combination of data and code. I think if you start with the correct bottom line, which is code and data, and then generate from there, I think that's actually quite realistic, at least in the first draft sort of thing. A sense. If you start in documentation and then try to generate more documentation, I'll be very careful with that because it's like the information density is very low again to where you start. And the other thing is what I really like is the summary of code, which is also what LLMs are actually quite good at right now. So if you have code already, so taking my favorite use case, I wrote code 3 months ago and I'm looking at it again. Then to have something that basically says, look, fundamentally, this step does X, Y, Z. And it's in this pipeline, and this pipeline overall does this, right? And these 3 steps do X, Y, Z, and they do a filter, and the code is filtered based on these 3 variables. So like these kinds of summaries that just make it easy to quickly orient yourself, which is again just an efficiency gain in terms of orientation, onboarding, knowing where you are, what you need to do. I think there it can get very useful very quickly. And as Tomás, we're starting to build this right now. Exactly these 3 use cases. Because I think they're the ones that are most realistic and useful enough at a high fidelity enough to be deployed. But of course, no one's tried it, so we'll have to see how good it is and if the quality is high enough, or if all statistical programmers say, this is causing me more trouble than it's actually helping. But everything is moving extremely fast, so we're going to be continuously monitoring it, continuously trying to turn this into something very useful, make the people who already have a lot to do much more efficient, and get rid of the boring stuff that occupies their brain so they can use it for things that are actually challenging and actually really important.
That's a good lead up to the last question that I wanted to ask. And this is for you, Henning. Tell our listeners a little bit about what's next for Verisian. What's next? What are we building next? What's in the roadmap for the next 12 months?
So for the next 12 months, I think it's really a focus on the statistical programming hub, which I already mentioned. So we have the analysis engine now, but we're going to expand that quite strongly, right? So right now we're looking at log messages, and we're going to start adding all of these things like a robustness score, scanning for just code that opens the analysis up to problems if there's missing data or if there's certain construct that is not expecting, these sorts of things. We want to then also move on to the analysis engine, which is this idea of building studies. So the analysis engine is actually a combination. It's both building studies, but also modifying existing studies. As I said, this added in confidence. So if you do make a change, what are the downstream effects? If you do need to make a change or write something new, what's the best place to start your analysis from? And if you read in a certain data set, you really know where that data set comes from, everything that it depends on. The other thing that we can do as a combination with the validation engine and the analysis engine is we can look at and process a lot of old studies that have already been submitted or run or whatever. Because if we look at these logs, we can extract the code, right? We can extract the macro resolve code. We already talked about that. And so what we can do is we can basically build up a library of code that has been written before, and we can organize that library, let's say by indication or by phase or something like that. So we can create a library of code for these different pieces that we can put together and maybe thereby make it much more efficient to build new studies. And this actually ties into the AI part discussion that we just had, which is that the core of fine-tuning these AI systems now for statistical programming, of course, requires that you fine-tune them with code. And so the tooling that we're building, incidentally, is handling code, right? So we're extracting, handling, rearranging, doing whatever we want really with code. And so we can use that whole framework that we have, all the tooling that we have at Verisian, to create data sets to train AI agents. So one of the ideas that we're really wanting to get into now, and we're looking for companies that want to do this with us. If you're a company that has a lot of studies, let's say in a certain indication in the past 20, 30 years, then to go through all of these studies in this particular indication and create sort of an AI agent for that company, for that indication that is fine-tuned on exactly how these kinds of studies were analyzed, and then help again with this efficiency idea that it can maybe suggest certain ways of doing an analysis or even generate very specific code. So that's, I think, a really exciting avenue that we want to explore. And that's all part of the analysis and validation engine. And these two, once they both exist, we can couple them, right? So that the validation engine doesn't become something that you run at the end of having written a bunch of programs, and then you run it at the end and you get a score and you get an overview, but that it's in real time. So it's attached to the analysis engine. And as you write code, as you get the AI engine to generate something, or as you reuse code from before, it basically gives you live feedback. You write a piece of code and says, look, if you write it at that point, you're not considering the case introduced 20 steps above for XYZ, that sort of idea. So these things really become, that's why they're together in the Statistical Programming Hub, because the programmers then, as they build or as they look at already built studies, they feed off of each other and everything becomes real time. So the idea, picking up what Sunil was saying, is the idea then would be that it's not that you're putting a script into your production environment and then you run this as a monitor, but it's always running. And so you get the feedback not only in production, but also as you're developing, like every single little piece of code, which of course just, makes the cycle time much shorter. So off of that then, and this is basically depends on feedback from the industry, what people are interested in, what are the greatest pain points. We really have a couple of other avenues. One is the medical writing hub that we've been looking at, which is basically what we also just mentioned, is to create first drafts of some of these submission documents based on the code analysis that we can do. I think we'll stay high level for these. So the submission hubs, which is this part that we are already also mentioned, where we really want to have regulatory authorities to give them the ability to explore studies that were created through the Verisian platform. So if you get a validation from us using the validation engine that says, look, your code quality is extremely high, you're handling all kinds of crazy cases, it's extremely robust, it's very transparent, we can't find any problems, we can't find all of the data standards are up to snuff, then we can package that and turn that in maybe as part of a submission, so that it's just yet another stamp of approval that says, look, this is really well done. So that's one of these ideas. And then also give them access to explore, then of course, this analysis, which they're free to do, or would be free to do. And underneath all of it, what we're imagining is what Sunil also already indicated, what would be useful is really to have a dashboarding system that covers the whole process. So we want to have a real-time overview of everything. We're calling it the monitoring hub. So we want to have a live overview of data quality as it's being collected and as it enters the realm of statistical programmers, the code quality, but also the status of the study itself. For a certain data set that you're interested in, or for a certain statistic or TLG, given the data that's been collected so far, what does that table look like? What does that statistic look like? So that you have a constant idea of, is your code actually running? Is it processing the data the way it's supposed to? As new patients come in, do the right buckets fill up, or is there a problem in the analysis that filters out a certain population which you really want to have? And I think that just needs to be real time. We can do it in all kinds of other industries, that as data is created, we know exactly where it's going. And that just needs to happen here as well. So that will basically cover the entire process in anything we're doing. And I think those will be the next steps. So the Statistical Programming Hub to build and to validate analyses, the Medical Writing Hub, the Submission Hub, and the real-time monitoring to have awareness over the entire study as it progresses.
Thank you, Henning, for running our listeners through that. There's a lot of work that we have to do for the next 12 months. That's certainly the case. We're looking forward to that. Sunil, do you have final remarks, whether it's be it for what Henning just mentioned or anything else you'd like to impart on our listeners before we conclude our first episode?
No, other than it seems to be really exciting from what I'm seeing, the tip of the iceberg. I'm really excited about the potential possibilities that are being available to SAS programmers and the things that we can do to better provide support to the team using these types of tools and advances. So I'm really excited to be part of this effort. Thank you.
And I think we're going to see you you're going to be at the Fuse US Connect, right?
Yes, exactly. I'm giving a presentation over there, so I'm looking forward to seeing both of you over there as well.
What's the name of the presentation, just to give a little bit of advertisement for your talk?
Oh, sure. It's in the professional development section. And as was mentioned, there is definitely a big transition going on from SAS to R. And what I've done is I put together a platform, r-guru.com. And in there, I feature a lot of things as far as making it easier for SAS programmers to better understand R. In addition, I have a whole page on Pharmaverse, which is dedicated to our packages supporting the pharmaceutical industry. I think that's the big trend that's going on, and look forward to giving that presentation.
Yeah. And we'll add the website to the podcast notes so that anyone who's interested should definitely go to the website, reach out to you if they're interested, and certainly attend your talk at Fuse US Connect.
Thank you.
Okay. And first off, of course, we're going to be there, and we've got some exciting stuff. We're presenting our work there as well. And if anyone's interested to connect with me, with Henning, with Sunil, don't wait until Fuse US Connect, because that's still 3 months away, actually.
That's
And
true.
we've got actually a webinar coming up very soon, and there's a lot more coming. I'm really passionate about building our community, and not just led by us. We want it to be a community effort. My background is in open source. I come from open source, and I think there's a lot of great things we can do by having open conversations. And the move to R is particularly relevant here, because we've also seen a lot of interesting push to R. And it's difficult because up until today, probably almost 98% of every single study has been done in SAS. Henning, is there a final remark you want to make before we conclude the episode?
I think it's really about the open source and the R. So that would be something great to get in terms of feedback. As Sunil is also looking into R, everything that we've built so far and that we're building, we can do also for R. And we've had these discussions going back and forth. And actually, one of the first things Sunil asked was exactly that. Can we do this for R as well? So of course we can, but we have to focus our development efforts somewhere. What I forgot to mention within like the next 12 months in terms of roadmap is that we are currently building everything for SAS, but if the community has a stronger pull towards R, then that is also something that we can explore and get started on. I would be really looking forward to feedback in that regard, to get a feeling for where everything's heading and where people's heads are at. And otherwise, hope to see many people at the webinar. I hope also to meet some of the listeners in Washington in February, or before then. Who knows how our paths will cross. But otherwise, thank you very much. Thanks, Sunil. It was an honor to be on here with you.
Thank you. I appreciate being here. Thank you for inviting.
Thank you all. And thank you to all of our listeners to listening to the first podcast of the Verisian Community Podcast. And I hope you'll find it interesting. If you didn't, let us know. That is actually great feedback. And I hope to see you at the next podcast or webinar or wherever that is. Henning, Sunil, have a wonderful day and evening. And until the next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.